When we imagine prehistoric mammals, we usually picture how they looked, the size, the teeth, and the fur. But there's something that I believe that does not get brought up quite enough. What did they actually sound like? What did our ancestors have to listen to when they were face to face with these great creatures? Not just roaring for dramatic effect, but communicating, calling to each other, warning rivals, comforting their young, and making noises simply because they were alive. The problem is obvious: sound doesn't fossilize, so at a first glance it might seem impossible to say anything meaningful about prehistoric mammal sounds at all. But this is not quite the case. By comparing extinct mammals to their closest living relatives, looking at skull shape, body size, and likely behavior, we can narrow things down. And a great thing with mammals in comparison to dinosaurs is we obviously have a much greater understanding of their biology, behaviors, and sound. It's not poking a stick into the dark, nor generalizing a Syrinx fossil for the whole group in the case of the dinosaurs. As we know, large mammals tend to produce lower frequency sounds. Animals with long snouts and nasal passages often make resonant echoing calls. Social species usually have a wide range of vocalizations, while solitary animals tend to keep things simple and functional. And that's the approach we're taking here. G'day everybody, I'm your host, and in this video we'll be going through 3 prehistoric mammals and creating some hypothetical sounds for them. As always, if you enjoy these videos, make sure to like and subscribe so I don't end up extinct like the animals in these videos. Now, I'll be honest, these aren't exact recreations. They're educated guesses grounded in anatomy, behavior, and modern animals that we can actually hear today. Think of this more so as a window into a lost soundscape, creatures whose voices haven't been heard for tens of thousands or even millions of years. And as they say, go big or go home. And we are starting off with Gigantopithecus. Gigantopithecus was truly one of the giants of the prehistoric world, not in cinema like King Kong, but in reality. It lived in the forest of what is today southern China and parts of Southeast Asia during the Pleistocene period. From the fossils that we do have, which includes mostly massive teeth and a few set of jaw bones, scientists estimate that Gigantopithecus was the largest ape to ever exist. It likely stood significantly taller than a human and weighed several hundred kilograms. The most important that we do know is its closest relative is the modern orangutan. Sadly though, Gigantopithecus is one of the most mysterious extinct mammals because we have almost no skull and no complete skeleton. Obviously, without a lot of fossils, it makes reconstruction a bit difficult. However, we can make inferences based on 2 things: its relationship to living apes and what we know about how great apes use sound. Modern great apes like orangutans, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas don't speak in a human sense, but they do have a rich vocal set. Orangutans alone have at least 30 distinct calls, including long booming calls that are utilized for territory and contact calls that are used to keep groups connected. These range from long calls to short barks to grunts to squeaks, and often social sounds depending on the context. Importantly, great apes possess the basic anatomy for controlled vocalization. Research on the Gigantopithecus' closest species, orangutans, have shown that they can control pitch and tone and even sounds that are beyond their normal calls when prompted. This demonstrates a flexibility in their vocal production. Because it was an enormous ape with a large body and assumably large resonating cavities, even though we do not have a vocal tract to measure, it's a reasonable scientific assumption that its vocalizations would have been deeper than those of today's smaller apes. Again, larger animals tend to produce lower frequency sounds, which can travel further through a dense forest. Plus, just compare the noises of a chimpanzee or bonobo produces to an orangutan or gorilla. Gigantopithecus may have used deep resonating calls to communicate across the understory of its forest home, possibly long, low rumbles for group contact, while sharper, louder calls were utilized when threatened or excited. We also know from modern primate behavior that vocalizations are often tied to social and environmental needs. Calls to maintain contact, express alarm, or to negotiate dominance. If Gigantopithecus even shared a fraction of social complexity seen in many apes, its vocalizations might have included a variety of vocal signals, from soft grunts between individuals to powerful calls that echo through the ancient forests. Obviously, we can't record a voice that's been silent for hundreds of thousands of years, but by putting all of this together, we can at least make an educated attempt. So with all that being said, here's the sound reconstruction I made for Gigantopithecus. We've crossed the first mammal off of our list, so now we're moving on to the next, this being Intelladon, also being known as the hell pig. Despite the nickname, the so-called hell pig wasn't actually a pig, they were something all their own. Sure, they may have been distantly related to pigs, but they were actually more closely related to hippos and even whales, still though not especially close to any of them. Intelladon lived over 10 million years ago during the Eocene and Miocene periods. It stood roughly as tall as a large cow at the shoulder, with long legs built for walking and a massive head dominated by an oversized skull. In some species, the skull alone could approach a meter in length, and this skull is the key to imagining what this hell pig may have sounded like. These jaws were deep and powerful, with thick bone and heavy muscle attachments, suggesting an animal capable of producing strong, forceful sounds. So the Intelladon is cool and all, but what noises would it have made? While there is no perfect modern analog, we can still utilize animals with comparable anatomy and behavior. Wild boars provide a useful comparison in terms of skull shape and aggressive vocal behavior, while hippos, despite being distantly related, offer an insight in how large confrontational mammals utilize sound to assert dominance. These are not animals that rely on clean musical cores. Their vocalizations are loud, harsh, and often explosive. Intelladon likely produced deep, coarse grunts as everyday communication, low-frequency sounds that would have carried well across open landscapes. When agitated or asserting dominance, those sounds may have escalated into a loud guttural bellow driven by rapid breathing and powerful throat muscles. In moments of high stress, during feeding, fighting, or territorial disputes, it may have emitted a more pig-like, high-energy squeal or snarls. Importantly, this probably was not a quiet animal. Its body plan suggests that it was an active, wide-ranging omnivore, more likely than not being a part-time scavenger and predator. Animals that compete aggressively over food often rely heavily on sounds to intimidate rivals before conflict even begins, and Intelladon looks like an animal that would benefit from this strategy. So instead of imagining a single terrifying roar, think of a constant vocal presence, heavy breathing and grunting as it moved around, and sudden aggressive bursts of sound when challenged. Less like a lion and more like an overpowered bull crossed with a hippo. If you heard the Intelladon before you saw it, you wouldn't think monster, you'd think something big, confident, and very, very unwilling to share. So here is my reconstruction that I put together for the so-called hell pig Intelladon. We have covered the Gigantopithecus and the Intelladon, and now it is time for the Megatherium to shine. At a first glance, some people may see Megatherium and think that it's just a boring ground sloth. However, I think that just because an animal doesn't scream its lungs out doesn't mean it's not interesting. Megatherium lived between the Pliocene and Pleistocene across much of South America. When this giant sloth reared up onto its hind legs, it could reach heights comparable to that of an elephant, and it weighed several tons. This was one of the largest land mammals to have ever walked on our planet. And yet, despite its size, Megatherium may have actually been quiet for a lot of its life. Closest living relatives we have are famously mellow. They produce vocalizations here and there, usually limited to soft squeaks or hissing when stressed. They seem to rely more so on stillness and body language than sound. Now yes, while Megatherium did live a dramatically different lifestyle, the modern sloths are still useful. Of course, comparing a small tree-dwelling sloth to a ground-dwelling animal the size of a tank isn't perfect. Megatherium was fully terrestrial, powerful, and interacted with its environment in ways modern sloths could never do. But even so, the types of sounds produced by sloths offer a useful baseline. There is also another living group that can help fill in the picture, this being anteaters. Anteaters actually belong to the same order as sloths, and while their facial anatomy is highly specialized, they still occupy a somewhat similar ecological niche to giant ground sloths, albeit at a much more limited level. Large anteaters in particular are terrestrial heavy-bodied animals that rely on size and strength rather than speed. Alike to sloths, they are generally quiet animals, producing few vocalizations and instead making their presence known through movements, breaths, heavy footsteps, and the sound of the environment reacting to them. But they still do make some interesting noises that I think can be useful. Taking into account the giant sloth's size and unique niche, as well as its modern relatives, I think that it suggests that the vocalizations of the Megatherium would be rather interesting, but not necessarily explosive. Instead of roars or bellows, its presence was probably defined by movement and heavy chuffing. Megatherium likely vocalized sparingly. Any calls it made would have been low, short, and subdued, perhaps deep grunts or soft grumble sounds produced in the chest rather than the throat. So imagine encountering a Megatherium in its natural environment. you might not hear it call out straight away. Instead, you may hear the trees shift, branches snapping, leaves raining down, slow rhythmic breathing just beyond your line of sight. So what might the Megatherium have sounded like? Well, here's the reconstruction I put together. Now that is the final extinct animal off of our to-do list. So in the prehistoric world, not every giant needed the same voice. Some may have been terrifying and some may have been almost quiet. And with that, we have reached the end of the video and I hope you've all enjoyed. As always, I'd appreciate it if you liked and subscribed, and I'll catch you all in the next video. See ya, mates.